it basically turned on the threat against us and welcomed people. We had people come into the service that would come in just to spy on us, just to report, just to put bad publicity out on Facebook.
Even from the little bit of the record we have, it's quite obvious that freedom of religion is engaged. It's at least engaged. Maybe there is no breach, but to say that the accused in this case can't even talk about it, it's really it just goes against the entire underlying idea of the Constitution meaning something and of us having freedom in this nation.
Sheila Gunn, Reid for Rebel News, and today I want to bring you an update in the case of Church in the Vine and Pastor Tracy Fortin. Now, the church as an entity and Tracy as an individual are in court right now in Edmonton, Alberta, facing the potential for upwards of $1 million in fines. That's if the judge applies the maximum and they are found guilty. Now, what atrocious thing would constitute that level of punishment for a church? Church in the Vine and Tracy are accused of obstructing a public health officer, which means they are accused of preventing a public health inspector from barging into the church on 3 separate occasions during worship services to inspect for COVID compliance. So yesterday, Wednesday, I spent the day in court covering the case. Now you can see all of my live tweets from inside the courtroom at rebelnews.com. And you can help Church in the Vine as they stand up to the Alberta government for religious freedom by making a tax-deductible donation to offset their legal fees at fightthefines.com. Now, I must tell you, I was the only journalist in the courtroom. You would think that a province persecuting yet another pastor would at least make the local news, if not international news, but the mainstream media could not be bothered to go to court yesterday. I should also tell you that supporters gather outside the courtroom for Church in the Vine because there are in-person limitations for people who can attend the courtroom. So these folks are not allowed in. On Tuesday, a convoy of trucks showed up to support the church outside of the courthouse. Now, the day started off with some bad news, or rather, some difficult news for the church and Pastor Tracy. Judge Judy Moore refused to hear charter arguments on behalf of Tracy and Church in the Vine. This is important because Tracy says that she obstructed peacefully and gently that public health officer. You see, she wouldn't let the health officer inside the building. She stopped the officer from barging into the church because Tracy says she was trying to prevent the violation of religious freedom, peaceful assembly, and free association of her congregation. We heard evidence yesterday that the health inspector had barged into the sanctuary, admittedly, while people were worshiping and praying and singing. The health inspector also admitted to trying to speak to Pastor Rodney Fortin while he was giving services. She also admitted that she was with bylaw officers as bylaw officers photographed people in the act of religious worship. We also heard testimony about people eating cinnamon buns and shaking hands and having coffee like it was evidence of a murder. The health inspector's actions were part of a joint task force between the City of Edmonton and Alberta Health Services to inspect churches for COVID compliance. We also heard from Pastor Rodney Fortin, that's Tracy's husband if you hadn't figured that out already, about just how seriously he takes his role in protecting the sanctity of worship services, particularly within the sanctuary of the church. He also testified that once CBC began reporting on his church as a bunch of COVID scofflaws, the negative attention prompted ne'er-do-wells and troublemakers to try to go to the church to disrupt services. Rodney testified that he didn't permit those people from going into services either, meaning it wasn't just Alberta Health Services and the government that he was keeping out. It was anybody who would disrupt and get in between the relationship of his congregation and God within the sanctuary of the church. Pastor Rodney also testified that he did his best to set up a time with the inspector to come in to inspect the church for COVID compliance outside of active worship services. They had even pinned down a time, but the inspector stood them up. After court yesterday, I caught up with James Kitchen, the lawyer generously provided by your crowdfunding donations to fightthefines.com for an update. And I also caught up with Pastor Rodney after he got off the stand. Take a listen to what they had to say.
The accused, so in this case that's Tracy Fortin, pastor of Church in the Vine, and Church in the Vine itself had filed what we call a charter notice, which is basically a document that says, look, we're going to make arguments about the charter, and we're going to make arguments about these particular sections based on what are the facts in this case. And if we can establish that the charter rights have been violated, we're then going to ask for a remedy under the Constitution to, have the case thrown out or whatever it might be. And what can happen, although it's fairly rare, is the Crown can come in and say, look, it's actually a waste of the court's time to even talk about the charter in this case because it's so obvious there will be no charter violation. And you can imagine, notwithstanding the poor state of the rule of law in Canada, you can imagine that it's a pretty difficult threshold for the Crown to meet to establish that, right? Because they're basically saying, look, even though everybody has constitutional rights, you actually don't have a right to talk about your constitutional rights in this case because it's just so obvious that those rights aren't violated.
Which seems ridiculous to me as a layperson because we're dealing with a church who acted to protect religious freedom.
Yes.
That's their defense, right?
Well, yeah, so that's part of their defense. I did plead freedom of peaceful assembly because obviously they're assembling on Sunday mornings. I did plead freedom of association because they're a private religious association. Maybe there's something to be said about, okay, do we really need to deal with those rights? I disagree, of course, but to say to a church and to pastors that they can't talk about their freedom of religion, I mean, it is a bit bizarre. I know we're in Canada. I know, we don't take a high view of religious freedom here, obviously. 2A of the Charter, which protects freedom of religion, has been seriously circumscribed in this country. Nonetheless, I still, it's funny, I shouldn't be shocked anymore, but I'm still a little surprised that the court basically said, look, there's just clearly no freedom of religion argument here. And yeah, to tell a church and pastors that when, the whole motivation for why they wouldn't let the health officer in was to protect the spiritual integrity of their service. It is a bit of a stretch and it is a bit bizarre. Even for the court here in Alberta in 2022, I'm just never not amazed at how far we will go to circumscribe our rights, and that's what we saw here again today.
Now, we moved sort of we did move into the trial proper portion, and we did hear that the health inspector openly admitted that she was attempting to enter the church during services on 3 separate Sundays, and she admitted to standing in the sanctuary while people were praying and worshiping and engaging in active fellowship. And it came out in testimony from Pastor Rodney, Pastor Tracy's husband, that they had set up a time for the health inspector to come and inspect outside of church services, but she never came. She stood them up.
Yeah, it was interesting today, and this was partly by design on my part, is we heard a lot of the testimony that we would have heard had we been permitted to talk about the freedom of religion violation. So, we actually heard that there was a freedom of religion violation, which, again, was a bit bizarre because the court had said, well, it's just so obvious there isn't going to be one. We don't even want to hear that evidence. But we saw part of it anyways, and that was by design, of course. I have to appeal today's decision. So, when I get to the Queen's Bench on appeal, one of the things I'm going to do is point to the record and say, look, even from the little bit of the record we have, it's quite obvious that freedom of religion is engaged. It's at least engaged. Maybe there is no breach. But to say that the accused in this case can't even talk about it, it's really it just goes against the entire underlying idea of the Constitution meaning something and of us having freedom in this nation. And obviously, if people have heard what I've said before, I always caution them. We don't actually really have freedom. The Constitution really doesn't mean anything. And I guess that's exactly what we experienced today, right?
Now, we are expecting another day of testimony tomorrow. What do you anticipate?
So tomorrow, we finished with Rodney Fortin today. We finished with the AHS officer. Tomorrow I will be calling Tracy. She's one of the accused. I'll be, asking her some questions about what happened. I will be calling a member of the church as well. I expect those to be quite brief, of course, because we're not going to get too far into the beliefs. And then we'll have submissions about whether or not the Crown has made their case. And so I think we'll be done tomorrow. And, we'll at least either have a decision from the judge or she'll have everything she needs to eventually give us a decision about whether or not there'll actually be a conviction in this case. And, unlike what I wanted to do there, I won't get to argue that, there was a conviction, but there was a charter rights breach. It'll just simply now be a matter of, is there a conviction? Is there not? And I have an argument for why there isn't, but we'll see how it goes tomorrow.
And remind us again, the church and Tracy are facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines potentially here.
On paper, yes, the legislation does permit up to $100,000 per offense to Tracy and up to $500,000 per offense to the church. So, we're talking $1.8 million. I do think that's unlikely, but like we saw today, all kinds of really awful things can happen. Even though, looking at the law, we would say, gee, I really don't think the court's going to go that way. So it could happen. That is a concern. Obviously, I'm going to argue that the fines in this case, there's a lack of all kinds of culpability that normally would have to be there if we're going to get really big fines like that. So I am hopeful we're not going to get fines of that nature.
So Pastor Rodney, you were on the stand today, and part of your testimony revolved around why it's so important for you to protect the sanctity of your church services.
Well, I believe that the sanctity of the church services are very important to protect because, God has made that church service holy. That place is holy, it's sanctified, it's set apart for Him. And so when we call a gathering to meet as a church, to worship, to pray, to meet together, that has to be protected. And so really I tried to encourage both the crown and the judge and those in the audience that heard that what we're doing is holy unto the Lord. And so it's really important that is understood and not taken advantage of. And we really feel like AHS, when they came into the church services, they were coming onto holy ground that had been sanctified, set apart for God, and prayed over. And they basically broke our charter rights in such a big way by doing that. So there's such a charter violation when they did that.
And yet they refuse to hear charter arguments. Now, I learned something new today, and I thought I knew your case pretty closely, but the negative media coverage that you received from outlets like the CBC prompted people to come and disrupt your church services. And you testified that it wasn't just AHS and health inspectors and bylaw officers that you were doing your best to keep out of the church. It was anybody that was disruptive, including people who had seen negative coverage of the church and were coming to disrupt it.
Yeah, that's right. We actually had to implement, after the CBC article went out, we had threats on our life, and we actually had to implement security guards, and we had to lock our doors and really scrutinize the people that were coming into the services, because it posed a risk to not only ourselves but to our body. But also, we didn't discriminate against AHS in particular. We looked at everybody that was coming in to make sure that they were coming in for the right reasons, the right pretense. And that's so important in this day. And they put us in a real awkward, bad situation when they put out that article and really in a big way defamed our church and spoke about us in a negative light. It basically turned on the threat against us and welcomed people. We had people come into the service that would come in just to spy on us, just to report, just to put bad publicity out on Facebook. And it was so wrong. And that came after that report, after the CMOH order came out in December of 2020. I believe it was 2021 when that came out. And it was actually 2020. It was 2020. So basically, we're still dealing with that, still having to have security, still having to watch over our church that way.
Now, people are going to see this, and they're going to be so outraged by what you're facing and what the church is facing and what your family is facing. How do they support you?
Well, you know what? There's several different ways. We want to encourage people to pray for us, to share these media posts with as many people as possible. We know that there's going to be some crowdfunding that's going to be out there in case there are some fines that are incurred. And you can go to Fight the Fines. Rebel News has done a great job at helping us with that. So you can go to Fight the Fines. I believe it's fightthefines.com. And you can go on there. It's Rebel News. And so we just really appreciate Sheila, Gunn, Reid, and Rebel News. It's so great to have you guys supporting us. So.
And we're going to help you every step of the way. If you do get fines, we promise. We fight the fines. We'll appeal. We think this is outrageous. The sanctity of everybody's worship should be protected, be it from the biomedical police state or busybodies motivated to persecute you thanks to the CBC.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, for sure. Like we just really think what they did was deplorable. And even for the AHS to post our CMOH order on as a public shaming, it's almost like a public shaming that they tried to do. But the reality is that didn't deter us, because we were doing what was right, and we continued to do what was right. So we're not deterred by doing what's right in the eyes of God, and we'll continue to do that.
Now I'm back in court Thursday, today, as Pastor Tracy takes the stand in her own defense, and I will once again be live tweeting the case. You can find my tweets at rebelnews.com. And if you are as appalled at the disgrace of the ongoing persecution of Christians by the biomedical police state in this province, a province whose motto is strong and free, please consider making a donation to defend the ability of pastors like Rodney and Tracy to protect their congregation, to be like shepherds at fightthefines.com. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. If you'd like to make a donation to offset the enormous legal fees of Pastor Tracy Fortin and her church, Church in the Vine, whose only crime, as I can tell, is keeping the government out of their church services while their church services were happening, please consider making a donation at fightthefines.com. And through a partnership with the registered Canadian charity, the Democracy Fund, all of your donations there now qualify for a charitable tax receipt.